Thank you so much for having me here, Joao. It's my great pleasure to basically start this lab. This is an interdisciplinary lab, so basically we're going to have philosophers working with scientists on a common theme. In this case, is self-consciousness and embodiment in humans and artificial agents. This is a dream that I always wanted, and it's realizing in Lisbon, and it's a magnificent city, so I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Before I start, a few words again about the logistics. Because I'm going to advertise my project and I'm going to advertise some positions and jobs in it, I'm going to start with the assumption that you don't know anything about me, about the work I've done, and what I'm doing, and what I'm planning to do. So basically, this is going to be a non-conventional talk. So instead of like presenting, the usual talk, you have one theme, an argument, and defend it. I'm not going to defend anything here. I'm going to just like overview the work I've done, my background. Uh, so um, the concept on philosophical foundations of the self-consciousness, a bit what I've done, what I'm currently doing, what I plan to do, and how I plan to set up the Conbod itself here in Lisbon. And I'm going to end with some words about the network that also coordinating on body consciousness in the arts. Um, and I'm going to start with a disclaimer because I'm an interdisciplinary researcher. So I'm a philosopher, but also cognitive scientist, and interdisciplinarity is a tricky thing. So everybody wants to do interdisciplinarity, but actually in practice, kind of difficult to do. So I'm going to start with a disclaimer. Philosophers will be most likely happy in the first part of the talk, and the scientists in the second part. So you need to be patient with each other, right? So I'll try to explain everything with the words and concepts of both scientists and philosophers in a layman's terms. Okay? So let's go. A bit of my background. So I did my PhD in France at the University of Dijon in Burgundy. It's a wine region, right? And it looks like Dionysius really likes me because I landed again in a place where actually the wine is very good, right? In Alentejo. So I did my PhD on physicalism in qualia, so basically the mind-body problem. So, oh, I realized that I forgot to say something important because I know there is audience online. So this is a hybrid talk. So I'll try to switch. I don't know if you see me, but I'll try to look at the screen and look at the audience at the same time. But naturally, I tend to look at the audience in front of me, right? So I apologize. I don't ignore you. I know you're there. So, so I did my thesis on physicalism in qualia. So basically, the mind-body problem, somehow exactly some physical stuff in the brain gave rise of some subjective experience, like qualitative aspect of our subjective experiences. It was in French, so it came out as a book on what is consciousness. And then I'll say, okay, so if there is something special about subjective conscious experiences, and my take was to leave aside for the moment the term consciousness in itself, because consciousness doesn't exist in isolation from experiences, basically. So typically people talk about consciousness, but that can be misleading because basically what we have are conscious experiences. And those experiences are having by a subject, right? So I started my inquiry with actually the notion, very basic notion of experience, right? And here is a basic definition. So experiences are particular spatial temporal events that consist in the instantiation of experiential properties by experiential subjects. So this means you cannot have a consciousness floating in the air. You cannot have experiences floating in the air. Those are kind of like related to a experiencing subject, right? Which is particular spatial temporal individuals, you, me, everyone. So this means that experiences do not occur in a vacuum, but they are intrinsically linked to an experiencing subject, to someone, as we call in technical terms in philosophy, a bearer, right? So we cannot even think of the occurrence of an experience without thereby thinking of involving an experiencing subject. That's Martinida Rumene said. And I agree with her. So hence, and this is important, hence the notion of experiencing subject is conceptually prior to the notion of experience, and the notion of experience is conceptually prior to the notion of consciousness. So I want to start with basically with experiences. This is what I want to try to motivate. Now, if I start with experiences, so I want to go back to the etymology and something very minimal. So what is basically a experience? Because philosophy understand in one way, scientists another way, and actually layman people actually understand in a very different way. So, for instance, we can say, "Whoa, I have experience with I don't know opening wine, right? Something that you did, right? So it's like practical acquaintance. So you kind of like practice that, right? So that's one way of actually understanding what experience is, right? And also to make the trial of the practical acquaintance to prove um, how to know by use, to suffer, to undergo. I experience something, right? As I said, typically in philosophy and scientists, experiences are regarded by philosophers and scientists as tacitly endowed with phenomenal characters, namely what it is like for me to have that experience. So this means that suggests that the subject undergoing this experience must be in position to at least have the ability to detect and access the phenomenal and subjective aspect of these experiences. And this is a huge literature around the phenomenal character of experiences, right? I'm going to leave that aside. So this is something I'm going to say from the very beginning. I'm not interested in a PH work. I want to leave it aside. I'm going to actually start. I'm going to use to put all my talk and actually all my entire work. I'm using something very basic, what I understand by experiences, namely something like exploratory, uh, practical, exploration of the world. Because the question whether experiences necessarily have phenomenal characters is debatable, right? Um, and this is something that we um, argue in this later paper that will come out very soon, is accepted. Back to square one, the bodily roots of conscious experiences in early life. Um, so it's the exploratory observation of the self and world from the very beginning. Okay, so what is really important in experience is the fact that we have a subject of an experience. So someone who has that experience, right? So that's necessarily any experiences has sort of like first personal characters coming from this perspective, right? So this means that you experience the world from your perspective, from that perspective, etc., etc. Now, philosophers like to make the distinction between the self and the I, that experiencing I or the perceiving I as a subject or as an object of an experience. That's an important distinction. So, okay, so I ignore. Okay, uh, I ignore that.
It's
So
okay, Anna.
William
Don't
James,
worry. Everything is okay.
sorry, yeah, oh,
Yeah.
okay, something happened on the screen, but that's fine. Apparently, it's not a big deal. Okay, so William James make the distinction between the self as a subject and the self as an object of an experience, and something also Wittgenstein makes the distinction. And I'm going to give you an example because it's easier to grasp, right? So um, suppose you are saying something like, I'm falling, right? You might be wrong about the fact that you are falling. Let's say that you're not falling, but you're having the experience of the hallucination and you're dreaming that you are falling, right? You are actually lying in your bed, you're not falling at all. But you have this experience like, I'm falling. So you can be wrong about the content of that experience, namely that you are not actually falling, but you can't be wrong about the fact that actually you having that experience, right? Whereas if I say something like, I look myself in a selfie and I said, oh, I look awesome in this picture, right? I might be wrong about that I in that sense because that may probably, let's say that's not me, but that my twin sister, right? So I can misrepresent the I as the object of an experience because I'm coming from a distant perspective, right? So the it's important. This is an important distinction because we're going to see later when we're going to talk about distinction between human and artificial agents because I think that's crucial distinction, right? So so this means that humans can take themselves as an object of an experience. I can see myself through other people's eyes because I typically don't see my face. But if I look in a mirror, I can see as an object of your experiences, right? So I can see how you guys see me as an object there in the world, right? So that's a distinction. Um, okay, something happened here. Mm. So I think it's blocked. And I'm not sure. Yeah, anyway. Oh, yeah, start again. Yeah. So the reason why is this important because people typically define self-consciousness with this perspective. So, for instance, you see yourself through other people's eyes, right? So, for instance, people say that children become self-aware or self-conscious around 12 months when they basically pass the Rouge test. I don't know if you are familiar with the Rouge test. So basically, you present the children with a mirror and you put some rouge on their face, and until 1 year, they basically when they present themselves with the mirror, they were going to look after the rouge on the screen or on the mirror rather than to understand that basically the dot is under their own forehead, right? So this means that whenever they detect the dot on their forehead, they become self-aware. So this means they kind of see themselves as other people see them, and they also are embarrassed, right? And this means that this is how typically this consciousness, self-consciousness, is defined as the ability to become self-aware in this way, right? So, and that's a way of defining reflective self-consciousness, which involves a subject-object relation between two different mental states. So I'm taking myself as an object of an experience from the outside. But there is also a tradition that says that basically we also have a pre-reflective self-consciousness or self-awareness with in the sense like the subject is something that's intrinsically present in each and every experience. Is the self as a subject that I give you the example before. So this is something that, for instance, phenomenologists and especially Sartre defended. So that they argue that there is a fundamental form of pre-reflective self-consciousness should not be regarded as an extra layer added to the ongoing experiences, but rather it constitutes the very mode of being of any conscious experience. So you cannot you cannot have an experience without being a subject of an experience, right? And that's the subject intrinsically linked to a experience. Um, so and this form of self-awareness pervades and constitutes every conscious experience without requiring introspection or reflection. So the basic idea here, in order to be self-conscious in this minimal pre-reflective form, is not necessarily, you don't have to basically be able to take yourself as an object of other people's point of view or perspective. You simply have, by being, having a experience, you're actually self-aware of yourself in this pre-reflective minimal way. Um, so I'm going to move forward with a disclaimer because I think this is something very important. So when we typically approach this type of in cognitive science and to understand what is mind, what is body, what is self-awareness, I think what we're experiencing right now is a sort of like remake of a debate that already took place a couple of years ago between Moritz Schlick on one hand and Otto Neurath on the other hand. So on one hand, for instance, Moritz Schlick was saying that all great attempts of establishing a theory of knowing, so how exactly we know the world, how exactly we know ourselves, comes from the problem of reliability of human cognition, and this question again rises from the wish for absolute certainty of knowledge. And we need to seek for unshakable foundation immune from all doubt and forming the firm basis on which the totemic edifice of all knowledge is reared. So, for instance, if you want to understand how the world works, how the mind works, we need to find what is the actual bedrock, right? What doesn't change and build from there. And typically, that's considered to be, well, the principle of mathematics or logic is something that doesn't change, right? So the natural bedrock on which, before building command systems, that itself sway. On the other hand, there was Otto Neurath, and Otto Neurath had actually a different take, and I agree. I'm with this guy, and he said, well, actually, this is can't be really true because actually the situation of a human being in the world is, and I like this metaphor, is far out of the sea as a sailor already in a boat, transform the shape of the clumsy vessel to a more circular, to a more fish-like one. And so basically, we cannot ever have a sort of like bedrock neutral on which we have to build something of the knowledge. When we start to investigate the world, we're already in the world, right? Already in open sea. So we have to deal with that, right? So it's way more messier than we typically like to admit, right? And this is I'm putting this disclaimer because I wanted to see the motivation why I made the jump from theoretical armchair analytic philosophy to basically doing experimental work and to actually understand how the works, how the self and how the mind and how the body works in here and now, right? So I basically jumped from the theoretical armchair into the empirical seat. Um, so I define myself as an out of armchair philosopher, and I spent a couple of time at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience in London for 5 years, and my job there as a philosopher in residence was to ask annoying questions to scientists. You know, what do you mean by perception? Can you please define social? And they were like, what do you mean? Yeah, we use it, right? Um, and one of the most annoying questions that I keep asking them is like, okay, so look around you. We are all adults, right? Investigating mind, investigating cognition, investigating embodiment. But why don't you have like children here, you know, doing this type of investigation, right? And people are like, what do you mean? This is trivial, you know. And I told you shouldn't have a philosopher, Marcus, you know, this is a waste of time. So, well, actually, it's not trivial when you think about it because when we ask question about the world, we already are in the world, right? So this means that we maybe have, when we ask question about certain features in the reality, that we have a theoretical adult-centric bias, right? So this means we need to take that into account. And this is something, for instance, I already started to do when I worked on this idea of like pre-reflective self-consciousness defended by Sartre. But I took a developmental perspective, right? So how we develop self-consciousness. So the question, my question was like not what self-consciousness is, not what pre-reflective self-consciousness is, but how it appears and how it unfolds and how it develops, right? It's more like naturalistic ecological way. And here is my reasoning. Okay, so let us assume that we all agree the fact that when the idea that experiences do not float in the air, right? They basically linked to a subject, an embodied subject. So as it happened, this subject, like humans, have a body, right? Um, so we are embodied human living organism actively engaging with the wider physical and social environment in order to secure survival, self-preservation, and potential reproduction. So this is what we do. We are sharing this with the animal kingdom, right? So recent years I've seen a sort of from the cognitive turn to an embodied turn in cognitive science, and also addressing, taking into account seriously this idea of like the importance of subjective experiences. And those subjective experiences are fundamentally linked to this embodied creature, to the human, right? And as it happens, we humans and embodied creatures, we have several senses. So we perceive the world through all the senses altogether. We have a cocktail of senses. So our perception is formed with this constant smell, touch, signals, sounds, vision, and everything. So we need to form this coherent sense of self to actually have a presence in the world. And this arises from both outside, but also inside our bodies. And we all know the example is like when you give a talk and you have your bowels and all, and it's like, you know, so it's like this self-related information comes from both inside and outside our bodies, right? Um, now, if this is the case, then this means that our perception, cognition, and action are fundamentally geared towards self-preservation. So this means that we need to maintain and regulate the psychological and physiological need of the integrity of the living organism, in this our case, the human body or individual, within a wider, highly volatile physical and social environment, because the world is highly unpredictable, right? So we need to maintain that self-preservation in the world. And in order to fulfill this fundamental condition for self-preservation, human needs to constantly move, act, and interact with the physical and social environment. So basically, to put it in a nutshell, you cannot really survive if you stay static, right? So you need to go there in the world and grab food and grab water, etc. And so one way the human organism complete this task is described by the influential recent predictive processing framework defended by people like Carl Friston, Andy Clark, and Yahoo Hochby. And in a nutshell, predictive processing proposes that the brain maintains conditions from self-preservation by extracting patterns of information from its embodied worldly interaction in order to generate self and world models of the environment. So these models form the basis of the so-called expectation of the agent about the causal structure of the internal and external world. So the basic idea here is that instead of viewing the brain as a sort of like passive sponge, passively receiving information, sensory information from the environment, what is actually doing the brain is basically actively anticipating the next sensory input on the basis of prior inputs, right? And then contrast is basically the anticipation, the expectation prior with the actual sensory input. And then if there is a mismatch, it sends back to the system what is called prediction error. And the model, self-model and neural model needs to update it flexibly in order to actually be able to interact with the world. So that's the basic idea. Now, if this is the case, I mean, I know that predictive processing is highly controversial. Many people kind of like disagree with this because, well, kind of explain everything. So I don't want to enter into this kind of like debate. I think we shouldn't throw the baby with bathwater. I think there is an important idea there in the sense like, yes, we don't, we anticipate, we experience reality on the basis of our prior experiences, right? I think that's fairly uncontroversial. Now, if that's the case, then in order to understand the nature of conscious experience in the here and now in adult life, so let's go back to my annoying question about the kids, right? It is essential to look at how this experience gets off the ground from the outset in early life. This is because there is no isolation basically between adult life and the previous life, right? Rather, it's like perceptual continuum. And the second one is that experience cannot be isolated from the experiencing subject, which in turn cannot be isolated from their bodies and the closest environment. Then one of the most fascinating things I found in human embodiment is that the most primitive and closest environment of the developing human body is another human body, right? There's something has been overlooked. And the idea here is that typically this is kind of like left on the when people talk about when they think about pregnancy is kind of like left to a certain type of individual that are able to become pregnant, right? But when you think, if you take my perspective in the sense how experiences unfold and how perceptually or when it's unfolds, then you realize that actually this is universal because regardless of the fact that you are able to be pregnant or not, we all come within another person's body, right? So that's a kind of like universal. So I'm taking that's my starting point, right? Hence the name of the lab, the core embodied self lab. So I want to start really with the basics. And this is something we argued in this paper that came out this year. Um, the first prior from co-embodiment to co-homeostasis in early life. So basically here we want to argue, so if you want to take embodiment seriously, then we have to really go back to the square one and to look at how basically the two bodies develop and dialogue with each other at the very basic level and how homeostasis is basically defined in relation to another body's homeostasis and allostasis. And this is work so this is the first paper of a thread of papers that I'm going to work and hopefully publish. So this is one just got accepted as well. As I said, this is work I did with Adam Safram and Jonathan Delafield. Basically, again, we say that if we want to understand perceptual experiences, we really need to go back to the square one and to look at the bodily roots of conscious experience in early life. And we like to use here the metaphor of the tree. So I like this metaphor. So imagine you see a tree outside and you want to understand how it works, right? So is it enough to actually look at the visible, observable, noticeable parts like the trunk, the leaves, the no? Basically, in order to understand how a tree works, you need to go back to the roots as well, which are not necessarily automatically noticeable, observable now, but you need to dig a bit, right? So what we want to say is that basically the invisible roots of our conscious experiences, those are actually the tacit roots that we're not explicitly aware of, but they still constitute our experiences, right? They're kind of like invisible roots of our experiences. And this is something, a work that I'm still pursuing, and with the brilliant Anjali Bhatt, we're going to work on, actually we did a paper on the nest itself. We look at the immunoceptive inference from an active inference perspective and the self-other differentiation prenatal development, because it's quite interesting what is happening in the womb, because you have the self-other differentiation, right? The two immune systems, they need to dialogue, to have a negotiation, say, hey, you are a foreign, but still mine. Is it you? Is it me? Who is this? Right? And actually, this is quite fascinating because this is something I would like to develop at a certain point to say, well, if you take the classical mind-body problem, right, how the mind relates to the problem, we have the pineal gland, right? Um, Typically from the Rene Descartes famous perspective, right? But if, let's say, Rene was a pregnant Rene and she was a woman, right? She was still a philosopher. Let's assume that at that time she was allowed to do philosophy, she was allowed to go to university, which is not, uh, something that is quite recent. So we need to keep that in mind when we discuss these issues. So let's assume that I'm a pregnant Renee and I ask about the mind-body problem. How many bodies and how many minds are in this individual, right? So already that issue, I mean, the mind-body problem would be framed in a very different way if we take into account the female embodiment as well, right? But that hasn't been done in philosophy. So, and this is something that I'm going to work on a book proposal. So basically, I'm going to go from the embodied turn to developmental turn. So how do you really perceive the experience and experience ourselves and the world from the outset? And this is work that I'm going to build upon previous work. So I try to argue that before we meet other people's minds, to understand how the other people think, we literally meet other people's bodies, and we develop a minimal self-awareness already from within, and involves different senses, more like proximal senses like touch and interoception. And we developed with Katerina Fotopoulou and Laura Kupchanelli the concept of a proximal intersubjectivity. And the key idea here was be that the body is not something or an entity that we relate to the world or relate to the others, but we literally need to take into account the fact that we relate to the world through others, but literally, right? Okay, so why is this important? It's important for the following thing, and this is why roboticists basically, you know, I'm having the discussion with them. So suppose you're a mathematician, you want to build a model of these things, right? So this plant, this human, these creatures, and you want to develop sort of like the simple model of minimal model of it. So it would be very tempted to basically take the adult, a form of this entity, squeeze it, and to make, oh, this is a minimal form of like cognition in plant or minimal form of cognition in human. But if you take a developmental and ecological perspective, you realize that actually the structural properties in the two cases are very different, right? So in order to understand a model of developing a dynamic entity, we need to really take into account the how things unfold through time. And secondly, experience in general have been defined on this um, model of visual distal. So I perceive an apple there, or I perceive myself in a mirror. It's a sort of like visual distal approach. Whereas in reality, as I said, our experiences are intrinsically and fundamentally multisensory. And this is work that I already published with Leo Schellbach and Ophelia Deroy, where basically we look at the multisensory base of body coupling in real-time social interactions. And this is a paper that I really like from Roy Solomon's group. Each time he's publishing something, I'm just like, ooh. I was like, oh, I agree. And he says, ooh, so we should exchange, from Israel to Lisbon, because we basically have the same take. So this idea that we really need to take to endorse a more ecological, multisensory understanding of what experience is. So here are some, some interim conclusion. So what I want to say is that co-embodiment comes first when we want to understand the embodiment, and the primitive fundamental experience are multisensory and proximal, not visual and distal. And one essential and overlooked aspect of current discussion of embodiment is that experience in subjects first develop within another human body, and that's universal, concerns all humans. And this primitive and fundamentally relational co-embodied roots of our experiences may have crucial impact on the way human beings start to experience self, body, and the world via proximal interactions. And I'm going to make an example. What I want to make, right? Okay. What is the difference, to make my point about the difference between, visual distal and multisensory, right? So you guys see here on the screen a pastel de nata, but what I have here, right? I don't know if you see it. It's a real pastel de nata, right? Okay. Mmm, it smells good. You have the cinnamon, you have the crunchy bits, you have a real multisensory experience, right? It's really, really very different when you want to have the sky coffee break. And I'm going to tell you why. Because if the brain's job is to maintain self-preservation to keep you alive, the fact I'm seeing food on the screen is not going to help you in any way, right? What I really need is actually to be able to grab pastel and to put it inside my body to survive, right? So the relevance of this type of like multisensory experience is really important because you really need to basically pay attention what is happening close to your body, right? In a very proximal way. It's not enough just to see the things out there. You also need to, and it's the same with also potential, because if our job is like to survive and potentially reproduce, it's like if you see a potential partner on a screen, yeah, but can I have offspring via screen? No. So it's like and this is why the brain treats this type of information very differently on a screen than the information that you have in real life. And we saw it, I think, during this peculiar period of the COVID, right, when we had a lot of information, distally via screens, and that somehow was like unsettling, right? Yeah. Oh, okay. Um, so do I need to mute here? No.
Okay, you can go
Thank
on.
you.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So this is why we need to go back to the subjectivity of our experiences. So we need to so the importance of the sense of self, the subjective first person experiences, or the first personal feeling of an I or a self bound to my body and distinct from the world and others, and also a sense of presence and the feeling that I'm immersed in direct touch with the real world here and now. And why is this important? So again, I really like Twitter because sometimes you get some very interesting things, iconic things out of it, right? So, as you all know, right now there is an important trend in psychiatry. It's like computational psychiatry. So people want to use data and algorithms to basically, detect feature of certain psychiatric disorder, right? So this is an emerging big field, computational psychiatry. And somebody tweeted from this field saying, well, we have some bad news from psychiatrists. They'll have to learn mathematics and statistics, right? And somebody tweeted immediately, said, well, bad news for mathematicians, they'll have to go to hospitals and speak to the patients. Because this means that you really need to have a sort of like, well, to go there in the world, to jump into the world, to actually gather the data, to actually make a model out of it, right? And I like this dialogue. And so this means that we really need to take into account seriously this first personal entrance into the reality, the subjective experience. And again, I'm going back to my tree because I really like trees. Is maybe the most important things are those you can't see and you take for granted. It's kind of like transparent, right? Or invisible, but I don't like the word invisible because I'm already using tacitly the visual metaphor, right? Let's say unnoticeable, but yeah, transparent. And the key idea here that I'd like to defend is that our sense of self, some people call it that is an illusion. I don't think it's an illusion. And I think the sense of self and sense of presence in the world is essentially constituted by what I take to be proximal sensory inputs, olfactory, proprioceptive, tactile, interoceptive, that are blended to form a sort of experiential transparent background that we typically take for granted or don't realize we have it around us. And we basically, this is how we experience the world. Because these signals are so pervasive and yet so essential to our being in the world, they seem to form a sort of tacit and noticed baseline. And we notice it, for instance, right now with the COVID, many people got their sense of smell disrupted, and they realized that basically, when you lose your sense of smell for, let's say, 6 months or something, your sense of self is also disrupted. So sense of presence in the world, right? Um, and this is something, an idea that we developed with Harry Farmer and Jane Charlton. Jane Charlton here is a person with lived experience of depersonalization. I'm going to talk about depersonalization in a couple of minutes. But the key idea here is that I like to use the window metaphor, the transparency of the window. So imagine that basically the sense of self is sort of like very transparent window that allows you to basically access a reality out there. And it's so transparent that you don't realize that actually it's something there. There is something there. But imagine there is a crack in the window, right? That sense of self is altered. Two things you notice. First of all, you notice that there was something there that you didn't pay attention to it, but it was there. And the second one, your access to the reality is blurred. You can't see the things. Yeah. And if your sense of self is created and constituted via relationally through interaction with the environment, so this means that if you cannot have that kind of like impression of direct touch with the reality, you also lose touch with yourself, right? So if you are detached of the reality, you also detach from the self as well. And this is something we develop in this paper, where basically we take the famous paper. So we are a bit cheeky here because we take the famous paper by Andy Clark, whatever next, the predictive processing. And here we want to say, okay, we agree, whatever next is really important. But here the word next should be understood not also next in terms of like what is coming next in the next second, but also next close to my body. So what is next to my body is highly relevant for my brain in a way that basically if I see the moon, it's nice, but if I see a snake close to my feet, that's a highly relevant and very it's processed differently. Basically, proximal input are processed differently from the distal one, right? Um, okay, so I've done with the theoretical part. Okay, so now is the part when actually scientists should be happy, right? Data is coming. So I'm going to talk about the personalization disorder and why I'm interested in a particular condition. Because as I said, if I'm interested in the subjectivity of experiences, I'm interested in the sense of self. I want to prove that actually this is not, it's all good. Uh, I want to prove this is not something illusory, but something actually can get disrupted. I want to argue that basically in the case of depersonalization disorder, basically we have a very clear example when precisely this transparent feature of our experiences, the sense of minus or the sense of self, is disrupted, right? And because because I take, as I said, experiences, subjective experiences very seriously, I'm going to invite you to enter into the phenomena through a first personal account of a person living with personalization, experiencing the personalization, right? So this is Jane, um, and this is how she describes how she, got the personalization. She smoked cannabis in March 2022, and that was the second time she was smoked cannabis. And this is how she describes it. So my perception felt as though it had been drawn back inside my head, almost as though I was looking at the world from the back of my head and I couldn't see the back of my own sockets. Essentially, it felt like there was a divorce or fraction between the world and me, so that although my body was still in the world, my mind was only an observer. And 15 years later, she still struggles to actually get her sense of self back. And basically, what she's trying to describe here is a bit this picture, right? So you have this feeling of being statically trapped somehow in the head, and observing, being hyper observed. And this is recently a very recent book by Joe Perkins. Um, he wrote a very nice book on depersonalization, again from lived experiences, right? So he suffers from depersonalization. So this is how she describes. I look in the mirror, it doesn't feel like myself. I'm looking at, it's like floating, not actually experiencing the world, and slowly fading away into nothing. It's like I'm autopilot in somebody else's body, right? And also with Jane, we wrote a more outreach piece on Eon on, again, this kind of phenomenological take on first person experience of depersonalization. But the condition was actually well known before, and it was defined as a state in which the sense of self and the quality of subjective first person experience are altered, such as the person feels somehow alienated or estranged, either from themselves or from the surroundings. Typically, they co-occur, but you can have cases distinct, so you can feel detached from the self without necessarily feel detached from the surroundings. Which is very important here, and I like to stress this is the third most common psychiatric psychological symptom in the general population after anxiety and low mood. It is understudied and underacknowledged, mainly because it's so difficult to describe. Right? It can occur in healthy adults following severe stress, traumatic life events, drug use, or as a symptom of another mental disorder. And I'm pretty sure everyone here already had this type of like dissociated depersonalization experience. If you had like smoked something or being drunk or had jet lagged, and having a car accident, you experience things, you see yourself like doing things, but you're not really there. And people describe this with lived experience of depersonalization, describe this very beautifully with metaphor. Because it's so difficult to describe, they typically use metaphors. So they say it's an experiential airbag, as if, if my brain doesn't want me to crash against a reality that would be unbearable, it inflates a sort of like experiential airbag that prevents me to crash against something that otherwise I couldn't bear, right? So, for instance, very often the rape victims describe this type of phenomena, where they say during the awful event, they basically dissociate and they look at what is happening from outside and say, well, this is horrible, but that's okay because this is not happening to you. And it's kind of like makes sense from, so this is a healthy dissociation. This is a healthy reaction towards something really unhealthy that is happening to your body. And the brain's job is to maintain you alive no matter what. And if for that it needs to cut that connection between the I and me, they will do it to prevent you to actually, crash. Um, yeah. Mm, mm,
Just like in car accident and suddenly accelerating and you're no.
No, 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 no. It's more like, for instance, like many people describe to me after they had a car accident. It's like they got off the car, they do stuff, yeah, but they do things automatically, as Joe said. It's like on automatic pilot. They know how to do function, They fill in the form, with the assurance and everything, but without really actually be there, right? And they also describe the experience as trapped in one's head and outside the body, right? So overthinking and disembodiment. And this is a paper that we submitted. Uh, we try to describe what is happening in depersonalization through a predictive processing lens. And I'm going to spend a bit of time describing this. It's a bit technical, but follow me. I'm going to try to be as clear as possible because I think it's an important phenomena happening here, and we have, I think, a good insight what's going on. So, what we want to defend here is two key ideas. So I prepared a bit the background, whatever I said, about the self-preservation, the embodiment, and everything. That you need to keep that in mind because it's like everything is kind of related to each other, right? So remember, I said that self-organizing living human beings, we cannot survive by being static. So we need to move, right? If you're static, you don't survive. I mean, you survive a bit, but not a long time, right? And you need to take action into the world in order to ensure survival and interact with others. In order to successfully prepare and engage in perception and action out there in the world, the human brain needs to be able to partly disengage or detach from certain self-related information. This means that you need to attenuate and process self-related information transparently in the background. I'm going to give you some examples later on. And the second key idea is disruptive somatosensory attenuation may lead to aberrant self-focus. So this means if you are unable to leave that in the background, this means that somehow the self will stand in the way. This means that enhanced and intentional bias towards one's own perception will basically stand in the way between yourself and the world and your experiences, right? And what we want to say is you have alteration in the ability to forget about the self and to optimally perceive, engage, and act in the world may further lead to increased reflexivity or hyperreflexivity. And at the phenomenological level, this seems to be captured by these feelings of being trapped in the head and outside the body. So here's a technical slide. So remember when I said that predictive processing is about, having anticipating the world, the next sensory input on the basis of prior sensory inputs, right? So that's, let's say, call it as an anticipation or an expectation, right? So you'll have an expectation, then you have an actual sensory input, right? So you have to match, right? And then the model in itself in the brain needs to decide, which one shall we go? Shall I trust more my expectation, or shall I trust more the sensory, right? So that's called the technical term is called the prediction weighting, right? A precision weighting. So shall I go left? Shall I go right? Right? So in order to be able to update the self when neural models, so all depends on that relative precision of expectation versus sensory evidence. So this means that the fine-tuning weighting of prior belief, so your expectation, what you believe to be true or to perceive, and the sensory evidence is often called, as I said, precision weighting, which translates selectively to attending to or ignoring particular sources of evidence, A or B, right? So in this view, attention is the process of affording attended sensory evidence greater precision, which can be seen as the complement of sensory attenuation. I'm going to give you an example to understand what I mean by that. So this means that increasing sensory precision means reducing sensory attenuation. That is especially when modeling oneself, because you are most acquainted with self-related information. You cannot escape the self. You know, you stop your brain stop processing self-related information when you're dead. Even when you sleep, the brain still keeps track of your lungs, your heart beating, right? You still have the self-related processing happening there, right? So this means that it's important to actually for the brain to be a successful and optimal agent in the world, you need to be able to disengage and to self-forget us. So that's called the somatosensory attenuation. So for instance, I like this example from Limanowski and Friston. When you pick a ripe cherry from the tree, you pay very much attention to the feeling of the tree on your fingers, but you don't really pay attention to what's happening in your arm, right? So that's attenuation of somatosensory attenuation. Imagine that each time you need to pick the cherry in the tree, you basically are aware of all your arm movements, right? Or when you play tennis or when you walk. When you walk, you just walk automatically. You don't actually pay attention to every movement that you actually do. And if you do so, you actually may stumble, right? So you need to be able to actually flow transparently to process that kind of like in the background. Process it transparently, keep track of that because it's important, right? Otherwise you fell into, a gap. But you do it, you can afford, you're doing so well, you can afford it to leave it in the background, right? So it's important to be able to actually self-forget yourself, right? Forget about the self. So, and this is why the reason also you cannot tickle yourself, because you anticipate what is going to feel, right? So everyone else can tickle you, right? They tickle, but if you tickle yourself, kind of like, yeah, because the brain, oh, that's boring. I already know. Yeah, I'm doing this. Yeah. So it has been proposed that the system ability to attenuate or to forget boring, by boring here means predictable. I expect that. I anticipate that. So what, right? Information enables the agent to select newsworthy information. Oh, cherry, tree, hungry, right? And so this is often the case in terms of attention of affording precision in certain aspects of the sensorium. The other side of this coin is attenuation of sensory precision that underpins sensory attenuation. And this selective disattention may be a crucial faculty that enables us to actually ignore sensory evidence that we have not acted when we think that actually we are acting. So the boring I is take it for granted. And now, a self-organizing system such as the human body is most intimately acquainted with, as I said, is self-related signals. So this means that the problem that the brain has to solve more often is not which sensory evidence to emphasize, but which to attenuate to order actually to allow you to go there in the world, right? And to act in the world, because this is how we survive. We need to be dynamic. And Jacob and Carl, they developed this very nice idea that said perception and belief about the self are unique in the sense that they are necessarily transparent because we need to process them correctly all the time, right? If this is true, then failure, let's suppose that we have a failure of somatosensory attenuation may lead to aberrant potential bias towards one's own perception and action, right? So this means that when people with depersonalization, they say that actually I lost myself, but basically what they are doing, they overlook over the self. They look over the self all the time. They observe themselves all the time. They introspecting themselves all the time. They highly existentialist. They ask about the universe, about the meaning of life, why I'm here, all this type of like information. So hyperreflexivity, overthinking leads to feeling of reality. This is what we want to um, argue. And hence the cheeky title that we get from Descartes, I think, therefore I am. We want to say, if I overthink, I'm not, right? So feelings of reality. And this is the disruption in a nutshell. I do not perceive myself as the cause of the action, but some other agent is. But I'm metacognitively aware that the other agent, the stranger, is still me, myself. And this is a feature that distinguishes depersonalization, for instance, from psychosis, where the patients basically buy into the story. So, for instance, again, I'm going to give you an example. So, if I'm with my friend and I have the feeling that somebody is tapping on my shoulder, and I feel that actually this is a real thing, somebody is actually tapping on my shoulder, I'm going to turn my head, and you're going to see me that I'm actually turning my head constantly, but there is nobody there. So that's an observer behavior, right? But if I still have this feeling that somebody is tapping on my shoulder, but I know that this is a subjective phenomenon, there is nobody there, I'm not going to turn my head because I know there is nobody there. So this means that you from outside, you cannot see what I'm experiencing, even though the experience of like, I'm empty inside is kind of like present. So, and this is why people with personalization from the outside, everything's kind of like typical, but inside they're exhausted because they need to think all the time. Wait a minute, so they self-regulate themselves, right? And this is something, a metaphor. Again, they're using a metaphor quite nicely. Um, sorry, they say you have the perceiving I and the perceived me object. So they use the a snowball metaphor. So they say, okay, imagine that you're holding a snowball, one of those that actually, and you feel that you're inside and you're looking at yourself inside, but you know that you are holding the snowball, and you know that both are just me, but doesn't feel like being me, right? So I cannot connect with the 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 I there, the me there, with the I here, right? And this condition led us to basically explore further empirically in an interdisciplinary project that I led with Dr. Harry Farmer. So again, was an interdisciplinary project. We had two philosophers and two neuroscientists, and we looked at the feeling of being strange from oneself, estranged from the others. We investigated self-other mirroring in depersonalization. I'm not going to, for the sake of time, I'm not going to walk you through all the papers, but I'm going to give you just like the first one for a very simple reason, is because it was my first paper as empirical paper and also as senior author. And I was like, hey, we have data, and it's like, wow, we need to analyze data. And Harry Farmer, who is actually way more experienced than me in experimental, said, well, try to chill, Anna, chill. Sometimes we have massive car crash, no significant results. We'll see, we'll see. I said, no, I don't care. It's like, well, and actually we were lucky. We got, significant results. And by the way, sometimes it's good. I'm saying this for the scientists. Sometimes it's good to have a philosopher with you that might, because as it avoids you to actually, throw money out of the window. If you ask the right question, most of the time you have significant results, right? This is a disclaimer for the scientists. Okay, so we in the study basically we use a paradigm is called the visual remapping of touch, and the paradigm is quite simple. So if I'm sitting here, right, and I receive tactile stimulation on my own body, on my cheeks, and at the same time I see myself on the screen, being touched on the screen, right? So and my job is to detect as quickly to detect as quickly and accurately as possible when which cheek I've been touched or whether I've been touched on the cheek. I'm quicker and more accurate if I see myself rather than I see a stranger. That's called the self bias. So if you match on the screen, for instance, a gender matched, ethnicity matched other with the self, basically in the trials where you see yourself touch and you see the other, yourself there, so you integrate the self-related information from the felt touch here to the seen touch there, then you are quick. And with that in mind, we said, well, let's try this on people that actually feel detached from themselves, because this means that they're not going to benefit from the self-bias if they see themselves as a stranger, so stranger to myself, this is how they describe themselves. This means that they're going to treat the self as a stranger, right? And they're not going to show the self-bias. And this is the experiment. So as I said, you have the self, other condition. So put people in the lab, we stick electrodes on their cheeks and deliver tactile stimulation. And we had two hypotheses that participants with high depersonalization traits will be less accurate in detecting touch and or don't have no self-bias. And I'm going to give you the most exciting results here. The paper is published. If you want to have a look. So basically what we were right in the sense like, okay, there is no self-bias, but what didn't expect is the fact that actually people with depersonalization, they have what they call another bias. So basically they are quicker to detect when they touch on their own body when they see the other rather than they see the self. And so this means that can be explained in many ways, but one possible way of saying this is because the seeing yourself is inhibitory, right? So it's kind of intense. Instead of helping you, it's basically prevent you to actually experience something. Right? And interestingly enough, this correlates with the anomalous bodily experiences from the Cambridge depersonalization scale, which is a scale that is used to assess the severity of the symptoms of depersonalization. So the stronger anomalous body experiences, the higher the uh, um, a bias towards the other rather than the self, right? And we did also a qualitative study on this. So basically, we look at the depersonalization experiences from a first-person perspective. Okay, so up to now, I described what I've done. I hope I haven't lost you by now, because the exciting part is coming right now. So in the next couple of minutes, what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to describe what is coming next, hot from the oven, so to speak. These are studies that I haven't presented yet, so this is new data. So I'm very happy to share with you here in avant-premiere. And some of them is already pre-printed, some of them we're going to pre-print in the next couple of weeks, but it's quite exciting. I want to share with you. And the reason why I'm presenting this because this is going to give you a sort of idea of what we're still doing, what we plan to do next, and the methods going to use in the lab. Okay. Okay. So this is a very exciting study. It's called Zoomed Out: Depersonalizations related to increased digital media during the COVID pandemic lockdown. And remember what I tried to convince you up to now, that we have this like at least two way of experiences. One is proximal, one is distal, one is multisensory, one is visual distal, right? So say, okay, so you cannot isolate. So our project, initial project, was like estranged from oneself, estranged from the others, right? And then COVID hit, right? I said, oh, wow, now actually we have people are actually estranged from the others because you have to keep social distancing. So let's look at what is the effect that basically on the self, right? So if you are estranged from the others, what's the effect on the sense of self, right? Because typically can't do that in a lab, right? No ethical committee will say, okay, let's isolate some people, say what's going to give on the sense of self. But that was kind of like, you know, it happened. So I said, okay, let's investigate this. So basically, we conducted an online study. We looked at correlated the Cambridge depersonalization scale, which is a screening that allows you to assess the severity of the depersonalization symptom. It asked in the past 6 months. So basically, what we ask participants is like, have you been in the lockdown in the past 6 months for more than 2 months? And we correlated activities that people did during this period, either visual, distal, and static, either multisensory and dynamic, right? So based on this hypothesis, right? So this is the activities that we kind of like contrasted. So on one hand, we put the digital media based kind of like activities, like people watching movies, people looking at films, at video on YouTube, playing computer games. So it's something like put you on a chair, watch a screen, right, and do something. And then we correlated this. So we contrasted this with cases where people ask what they do, manual activities like cooking, gardening, you know, something multisensory pottery, and also the time that people spend inside and outside the flat and doing physical activities, right? And also we ask participants how many hours they spend before the pandemic doing this type of activity, such as to have contrast between the two. So this is the results. So during the COVID lockdown, participants reported spending most time watching non-interactive audiovisual media and online meetings and playing computer games. So basically, this is the activity that's skyrocketing during the. What we found, interestingly, is that increased use of digital media-based activity correlated with higher feeling of personalization, interestingly, again, increased the participation online social e-meetings via technology-based platforms such as Zoom, Team, Skype, etc., also positively correlated with personalization experiences. And people who reported that they were spending more time during the lockdown engaged in sedentary digital media consumption, such as watching TV, films, video, also show the personalization trait. So this shows, we argue, that in order to feel closer to yourself and more embodied, right, we need to move our body and stay away from sedentary digital video-based media, right? And actually, too much Zoom meeting may transform into zombie. So try to move your body. Don't stay too much sedentary because, as I said, the same thing with, you know, we have evolved to look at the pastel de nata on the screen. Yeah, we have evolved to actually eat it. Yeah, and to meet people. So the second study I'm going to present is something we're going to preprint in the next couple of days. It's something that a study that's been brilliantly done by this amazing researcher, Lara Meister. So basically, we wanted here to link the body from within, the signals from within the body, with the self-based representation and the personalization. So here we had a total sample eligible of 82 participants, again, high and low DP group. And basically, we use a reverse correlation task. And the accuracy of each participant's resulting self-portrait was assessed objectively using a face recognition algorithm. So which provides a sort of like self-specific similarity score between each individual self-portrait and a photograph of their real face. Right? So we looked at how good they are people to actually keep in the working memory a self-face representation. And we also, and we found that depersonalization is linked with decreased self-face, impoverished self-face representation. And when it's still ongoing data, so we still need to analyze it carefully because also we did an interoceptive measure for it. For now, it's just online, but we found that attention regulation, self-regulation, and trusting were significantly negatively correlated with CDAs. So this means basically the most frequent intense depersonalization symptoms, the lower the interoceptive sensibility and this domain. Okay, so now we need to write the paper around this triangle, a tripartite relation between the feeling within your body, the self-face accuracy, and the feelings of depersonalization. Another study I'm very fond of, I really like because we managed somehow to do a touch study during the COVID, right? And this was done with this brilliant researchers Mel Fairhurst and Ophelia Leroy in Germany. And we looked at affective touch and feeling of depersonalization. So affective touch, very briefly, is so very briefly for the sake of time. So it has been recently discovered that basically we have two, you may have two actually different circuits for tactile perception. One is for the discriminative touch, which just like arouse you to actually discriminate, is it rough, is it smooth? And the other one is what they call the social or affective touch. Is basically this like receptors that we have only on the hairy skin. So we don't have it on the palm, we don't have it on the lips. And basically this kind of like we call the CT, tactile receptors. So basically, they're activated when you gently stroke the skin at a certain velocity, right? If you do it too quickly, it doesn't work. If you do it too slowly, it doesn't work. Also, the temperature of the hands is really important. It has to be at the warm, the body temperature. If it's too hot, it doesn't work. If it's just too cold, it doesn't work either, right? And this is important because it has been argued by many people that is touch and not vision, which is the first of senses to develop in this most primitive way of actually meeting the external world. Because in the womb, we have vision, obviously, but the eyes are mostly closed. We can perceive light through the eyes. But imagine that you are in the womb and basically you don't have you are surrounded by amniotic liquid. So basically, like the experience that you have when you are in the water, you have tactile stimulation all over the body. So you have enhanced self-related processing across your skin because the skin is the largest and the oldest of your sensory organs, right? And it has been argued that the skin And the tactile experiences play a crucial role in development because it's important to actually keep close connection with the between caregivers and children, and that has massive impact on cognitive abilities later on if that is disconnected. And some people say, oh, maybe this is important just as because at the beginning, when you are more vulnerable and you need to be in touch with other people and with your caregivers. And actually, this is wrong because the need for touch and tactile experiences increases with age. Yeah, so it's like we really need to be in touch with others. So there is something special about touch more than a simple sensory stimulation on the skin. And see the case of COVID, right? So there's something that we crave during this period is like to basically literally be in touch and literally in touch with others, right? And in this study, we had 108 participants. We had 57 high, 51 low, and basically we did something. Actually, this is work by Merle. She's brilliant, and she's also a musician. And this is how she got the idea. I said, well, so let's do a study where we basically ask people to do a sort of like self-intervention of affective touch, on the sense of self. But how are you supposed to do that, right? You need to actually be careful that actually going to follow the good speed, And this is an online study. We don't know how people will do it. They home, right? So how are you going to control this? And since she is a brilliant musician, say, let's use the metronome because when you play piano, you have boom, 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 boom. That gives you pace, right? So let's incorporate in the video, right, a metronome that will give the participants the correct pace for the 60 optimal touch, right? And all it has to do is say, well, just follow, stroke yourself, on that. Yeah. So we also had a control condition where basically participants didn't have to stroke, but they put their arm on the hand on the opposite arm. And the rationale behind this was to control for the effect of dynamic affective self-touch as opposed to passive self-touch, right? So in both cases, you have self-touch, but in one case, it's affective, dynamic, and otherwise, it's not. And what we found is we saw that both high and low people with depersonalization symptoms following a self-touch intervention increased the rates of vividness of the experiences. What is interesting is that we found no significant effect of the pleasantness of experiences, and this is something we need to do explore further on. Maybe pleasantness will be modulated if somebody else touches you, right? Because it's kind of like it has a more social component, right? But the vividness is there. So that in itself actually was enough to increase the vividness of an experiences. Another super cool project that we're going to do it with the amazing Helgi Gilmester. So we're going to look at dreams and depersonalization. Remember, I told you the tree, right? The invisible, the reflective, or the transparent roots of the tree. So your sense of self doesn't disappear when you dream, when you sleep, right? There is something still processing over there. So we want to see whether there is connection, there is sort of continuity. So here's what was here's our question. So how do you relate with yourself and experience yourself when you feel detached of yourself in your wake life? Is it in that in your dream you basically feel even more detached, or on the contrary? Basically, because you kind of like switch off this kind of like metacognitive hyperreflexivity kind of like, you know, engine, maybe the brain retrieves somehow during the sleep some sort of like self-related processing on a very fundamental basis, right? So this is something we're going to do. This is on clinical population. We have 750, if I remember correctly, of reports, dream reports from this people. We need to analyze a lot of work, but it's really exciting. Another project what we're doing again on dreams and multisensory experiences is here I have a minor role, is led by Dr. Jane Aspel. Again, we're going to look at the relationship between dream experiences and embodied experience in a wake and a dream life. Okay, so that's what I'm fine. Okay, you've been patient. Thank you. Fine. So what I'm going to do next, so this is the project that you see up to now. This is our project that are ongoing, that are rolling, right? So what I'm going to present right now is the project I'm going to start. So this means I'm going to hire people to work with me on these themes, right? So the first project I want to advertise is called It's a Kind of Magic. We're going to explore multisensory modulation of the sense of self through body movements and action observation in the depersonalization and psychedelic experiences. Basically, going to try to see whether we can contrast alteration of the sense of self and self-perception in this two type of populations, right? And what we're going to use, so I'm going to hire a research assistant working with us from February next year. And this is the magic shoes paradigm that we're going to use. This is fabulous work done by Ana Tajadura Jimenez. She's based in Madrid. She's at an ERC consolidator working exactly with this method, which is pretty cool method. Basically, so she incorporates self-related information processing of the sound of movement that you produce, because we all produce sounds when we walk, right? So that's your footsteps. That's self-related processing, right? So we're going to use the self-related modulation of the sound that you produce yourself to basically see how we can modulate the sense of self in people that feel detached from their body and detached from themselves. So basically, we try to expand basically the sensory augmentation. Basically, we're going to work with also some devices that we're going to people doing arm movements, for instance. The device will calculate the acceleration, the weight of your arm, and it's going to translate into sound. So basically, we're going to create a sort of like auditory body that we typically don't have. But with the magic shoes, it's even more interesting because magic shoes is something that it's natural, right? So if I move my body like this, I don't typically make a sound, right? But when I walk, yeah, I'm typically to make a sound. So that's more like a naturalistic set. So that's one project. So we're going to do, we're going to also measure the perception from the body or the body from within, interoceptive measures. And the second project I'm going to hire people is called the interacting self, because up to now I talked to you only about humans, but now I'm moving to basically to artificial agents as well. So we're going to look at how different type of interaction with different type of artificial agents and embodied artificial agents impact the sense of self in humans. And this is a project that I'm leading with a fabulous team. So well-established researchers, but also up-and-coming rising stars in their fields in virtual reality, robotics, FNES, and social interactions, and also in philosophy and clinical science and psychopathology, and from the sort of like phenomenological perspective, because I'm keeping this entrance point. For me, it's kind of like fundamentally, the only way to actually experience perceived reality is through our subjective experience, right? That's the basic, right? So we're going to so basically what we're going to do is going to have I'm going to hire one PhD and one postdoc starting January 2022 to work with me. So we're going to work with virtual reality. We're going to go work with robots and personal assistants like chatbots. So basically, we're going to this type of artificial agents have different type of embodiment, right? A virtual reality character is very differently embodied than a robot, right? And a robot can be humanoid or non-humanoid. And we're going to look at different type of like dyadic interaction between human and human and artificial agent interaction will impact the sense of self. So that's a bit very general about the projects I'm going to establish here in Lisbon, and I'm going to hire people to work with me. So now, what if you are a candidate and you want to work with me? What you can expect, right? So this is a friendly, vibrant, inclusive, interdisciplinary environment, and I know everyone says this. Oh, this is a friendly environment, but for those that actually know Portugal and they know me, they know that actually this is real. Portuguese people in Portugal is they're really really welcoming and friendly. Um, then you can expect from me constant support and mentorship. I really like to advance people to have their own ideas, push them there in the world to establish themselves. Basically, I'm a fabulous PI, fabulous team, and a fabulous team, right? We're going to do groundbreaking science, working hand in hand with philosophy. As I said, it's not only about science, but also about philosophy and asking fundamental questions to avoid actually having massive car crash with the data and just like throw the money out of the window. In order to have like meaningful information, we need to work with philosophers hand in hand. Nobody's up, nobody's down. This is a team where shoulder by shoulder, right? As I said, we're going to use VR methods, ECG, FNIAS, robotics, psychophysiological, behavior, qualitative measures, computational modeling, and perceptual analysis. There is training available for some of these methods. So you're going to be receive training where it's work with me. And in addition to the science part, you're going to also be involved in something really, really interesting that I really, really want to develop. Again, based on an idea, why is it important to basically keep the subjectivity open, the subjectivity of the experiences? So I'm going to launch the Network for Embodied Consciousness and the Arts in October next year here in Lisbon, and it's going to be around mid-October. So in October, it's going to happen three important things. First, we're going to have the first workshop of an interself project. We're going to have the closing workshop of the Magic Shoes project, and we're going to have the launching event of the Nectars in the same in a row, so to speak. So basically, the people from this conferences and this project will be able to mingle and interact with each other. And the basic idea here is to use arts to bring attention to the importance of actually keeping an eye on the subjectivity of the experiences. Because if there is something I learned, for instance, from my project as a researcher, working on depersonalization is just how much I learned by just interacting with people with lived experience of depersonalization, right? And how much basically they trying to describe, because these are not academic, they are not using our words. And sometimes when we talk back to them, it's kind of like, and they use metaphors, the way to describe. And I want to use performative art as a sort of bridge, communicative bridge between art and science to bring attention, first of all, around the condition of this depersonalization, but not necessarily just depersonalization, but more generally about the importance of basically keeping in touch with the subjectivity, basic embodied subjectivity of our experiences, to keep in mind the fact that we are dynamic creature, we have evolved to move and to interact with others, and we cannot be alone. And actually, I think by now we kind of like realize it with the COVID, right? We kind of really need each other. And it's so important to actually keep in touch with your own body. And this is something, for instance, my students were saying when the pandemic started, they're calling me and say, "Oh, I can't focus on the paper. I can't do any abstract work." And it's like keeps thinking of my body. And say, "Well, that's a very good news. It's like if your brain saying things like, well, I don't care about that abstract information, right? Take care of this right now, because it's like if you don't sorry, if you don't take care of this body here, body creature, then you're not going to be able to do any type of abstract work later on. So I said, well, don't worry, this means they're fully functional, and that's good news, right? Focus on the embodiment. And this is something we're going to develop in collaboration with McMaster University in Canada and the University of Prague and the Royal College of Art in London. And this is going to be really, really exciting. So we're going to have art events. We're going to have installation, multi-sensory installation, interactive installation. We're going to do interactive workshops. And again, to bring this idea that we need to keep in mind the importance of subjective experiences. And I recently actually visited the Champollion Center, here in Lisbon. And somebody described to me, said, well, he showed me a building. He said, well, this is the Pancreatic Cancer Center. And he said, well, it's the first center, basically, we're going to have the research and the patients in the same building, right? And when you think about it, it's like, it's like typically it's kind of like disconnected. And we have this disconnection between the mind and body to a certain point that basically it's so rooted in our society that basically when you have a problem with the mind, you go to a mental health institution. If you have a problem with your liver, you go to a physical health institution. But if you look at the reality, basically we're not two entities floating, minds there and bodies there. Basically we are one single embodied, right? And we need to figure out how the two are connected. And I want to use these tools that performative art put at our disposal to bring attention around this basic idea. So if you're going to work with me in the Code Embodied Self Lab, right? So what is the implication? We're going to question the individualist static solipsist approach of understanding perceptual link between the agent and environment. You're going to question the adult-centric thesis of a full-fledged human raising like Athena from Zeus' head. Rather, we're going to develop this idea that humans emerge within other humans and in close contact with other humans through close interaction with other humans. Question the idea of self-awareness, minimal self-development independently of other self. And question of idea of perception being a solitary and distal endeavor, like seeing a red apple on the screen. And this is something we're already kind of like collaborating with some artists in London. So this is Friendred. So he works with a very nice team at Goldsmith, exactly on this idea, so how you can build connection between moving movement and embodiment and artificial intelligence. And this is something we already developed in this special issue that just came out. And you just need to read the, I need to write the editorial. Papers are out on disembodied perception of the self and other. And I'm going to end with a shout out to a special issue that is still accepting papers, edited by colleagues and friends of mine, Adam Safram, Ines Ippolito, and Andy Clark. Again, they will try to link this kind of idea of like embodied cognition, living individuals, and robotics. And for those who are not in Lisbon, I said it would be nice to actually show you some pictures of what the space looks like. Because, well, if I work in embodied cognition, I'm an activist, I need to show, the place, yeah. And this is a very cool student. If you like peacocks, you're going to see all over the place. And as you can see, they kind of have the same colors as our center. It's kind of like very elegant. And also, the food is amazing. The city is amazing. And on that note, if you have any informal inquiries, please write me at this email. If I don't reply immediately, don't hesitate to nag me. I'm receiving a lot of emails, but eventually I'll reply. And that's it from me. And thank you for being so patient. And I'm happy to take your question now.